former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. He's authored a book titled Diplomacy. The event has started, and we'll now bring it to you live.
And if everybody who's coming in wouldn't mind taking their seats, I think we can get going here. It's nice to see such a large crowd. I'm Sandra McElwain, the chair and moderator of the author book wrap session. Can you hear me? No. Great. Well, okay. I don't know why there are two, but anyway. And I'm going to introduce Dr. Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was born in... Can you hear me now? I'm Sandra McElwain, the chair and moderator of the author book wrap sessions. Thank you, Henry, very much. Is this doing it now? Okay. Henry Kissinger was born in Fürth, Germany, came to the United States in 1938, and was naturalized an American citizen in 1943. He served in the Army and attended Harvard for both his undergraduate and graduate degrees. He was a member of the faculty of Harvard and director of the university's International Seminar before coming to Washington as assistant to President Nixon for National Security Affairs. Dr. Kissinger was sworn in as the 56th Secretary of State on September 22, 1973, a position he held until January 20, 1977. Under President Reagan, Dr. Kissinger chaired the National Bipartisan Commission on Central America and served as a member of the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. At present, he is chairman of Kissinger Associates, Inc., an international consulting firm based in New York City. He is an advisor to many international organizations and is on the board of a variety of corporations. He is the author of 10 books, not including this one, and writes a column for the Los Angeles Times Syndicate. I'm very pleased to welcome Henry Kissinger to our book wrap session.
Sandy and ladies and gentlemen, Sandy neglected to mention one historic achievement that I have to my credit, which I would like to get on the record here in Washington, that for a 2-year period, I was simultaneously National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. And I insist on mentioning this only because never before and never since have relations between the White House and the State Department been as harmonious as they were in those days. When I shouldn't really say this at an event that celebrates a new book, but when Sandy mentioned that I'd written 10 books, I can tell you that one of my previous books was described by a British reviewer as follows. Said, I don't know whether Mr. Kissinger is a great writer, he said, but anyone finishing this book is a great reader. Because that was in the days when I wrote 1,500-page books. My current one is a short one. It's only 900 pages. It's 600 pages shorter than my memoirs, which I saved that space by dropping the word I, since it was not the... Now, actually, I mean, quite seriously now, I have never done this sort of thing before. I have never spoken before an audience with the task of speaking about something that I've written. And I won't do it today either. I will tell you some of my concerns about foreign policy and what the problem is that I tried to deal with and that I tried to get at in writing this book. And then if you want to know what's in it, I'm afraid you'll have to get it. And when I'm through with my remarks, I'll take questions which can be perhaps more specific than my remarks. Now, Sandy has said that I should talk for about 20 minutes. And if I keep to that, of which there's very little danger, then you can all say you were present at a historic occasion. Now, what is the problem that I've been trying to deal with? I believe that the United States, in its approach to foreign policy, has had a very unique experience, not shared by any other nation. And that the period in which that policy could thrive has come to an end. It came to an end because of our successes, not our failures, with the end of the Cold War. That is the key fact regarding American foreign policy challenges today. Throughout its history, the United States has been characterized by the fact that it is the only sizable nation in the world that was peopled exclusively by immigrants. The only major nation that was created to vindicate the idea of liberty. And the only major nation that had not to concern itself with the problem of security for the greatest part of its history. Because after the first generation of Americans, the United States could choose whether it would involve itself in international affairs or not. Two very distinctive approaches developed to American foreign policy. The idea that America fulfilled its purposes best by turning itself into an example for the rest of mankind, emphasizing its domestic institutions. That was the dominant trend in the 19th century. Starting in the 20th century, they developed the idea that America fulfilled its special obligations best by going out into the world and spreading its fundamental values, implementing and promoting democracy. And for a good part of the 20th century, the internal American debate oscillated between those two extremes, or between those two positions. But both positions were based on the proposition that the American experience was exceptional. And it therefore led to an attitude in which America believed that if it was involved in foreign affairs, it was for principles, not for interests, for causes, and not for national purposes. And for example, at the end of the Second World War, President Truman sent an ambassador to visit Churchill, who was then Prime Minister. It was a man called Joseph E. Davis, who had distinguished himself when he was ambassador to Moscow by taking Stalin's side in the purges and arguing that the victims of Stalin's purges were guilty of what Stalin had charged him with. But that is not my point. My point is he went to see Churchill, and then he wrote a report in which he said, Mr. Churchill is undoubtedly a great man. But you have to remember that he's pursuing the British national interest. Whereupon Admiral Leahy put a cover sheet on that, which in effect said, Mr. President, isn't that what I've been warning you about all along? Now the idea that a British Prime Minister would pursue the British national interest should not have come as a startling discovery to outside observers. But if you read what American presidents and most frequently secretaries of state have said throughout this century and probably throughout our history, it has always been that America is altruistic. As late as the Gulf War, President Bush said, we prevailed because we were defending international law and because everybody else knew we had no ulterior motive. The problem with basing foreign policy on general propositions universally applicable anywhere in the world means that we lose the capacity to differentiate individual cases. And I would argue, for example, that one of the misconceptions that involved us in Vietnam was precisely this. At the end of World War II, George Kennan, Dean Acheson, John Foster Dulles developed the theory of containment, which argued that communist aggression had to be resisted anywhere where it took place. Anywhere. And therefore, once our leaders were convinced that communist aggression was taking place in South Vietnam, as indeed it was, they could not make an analysis that said, is it crucial to American security? And secondly, if it is crucial, do we have to defend it in South Vietnam or can we defend it in some more propitious place? This, in any event, has been the American attitude through much of our foreign policy experience. And it also led to a conviction that since stability is normal among states, if there is a conflict, it must be caused by evil men. And when you deal with evil men, you have two choices. You can destroy them, or you can convert them. And we've tried to do both. We had, for example, President Reagan. At the same time that he said the Soviet Union is an evil empire, wrote in his diary that if he could only get to meet a Soviet leader And if you could show him, by taking him on a helicopter ride, that most Americans have, or many Americans have swimming pools, that he would see the error of his ways and become like a nice Midwestern American. I have a friend who is of the view that there is no such thing as an English accent, that the English put this on to intimidate Americans. And if you can only catch an Englishman unawares, like waking him up at 4 in the morning when he's not ready for you, he will talk like a normal human being. This is an attitude that we often also characterizes our foreign policy. In 1917, when the United States ended World War I, the German emperor had been governing for 27 years, for 29 years. And he had been an unshirted nuisance. But it had never occurred to anyone that the peace of the world depended on his removal. When the United States ended the war, the domestic structure of Germany became one of the principal war aims. And we have gone through this at various phases. If we were allied with somebody, we also tended to ascribe good moral qualities to him. So, for example, during World War II, Joseph Stalin, fresh from killing almost as many Russians as the Germans were, and the purges, suddenly became Uncle Joe. And Harry Hopkins could write from Yalta, "We have no doubt about the moderation and goodwill of Joseph Stalin, but we do not know what sinister forces are lurking in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to thwart his design." Can only hope that nobody intercepted that letter, because it would have started another big purge in the Soviet Union, since looking for people in the dark recesses of the Kremlin was Stalin's specialty. So we see it also in the post-communist period. First with respect to Gorbachev, and then with respect to Yeltsin. The United States has identified good relations with Russia, with a particular Russian personality, and believed that changing the domestic structure of Russia was more of a key to a peaceful foreign policy than dealing with its actual foreign policy performance. My point is that the period into which we are moving will not be very hospitable to such an approach. At the end of the Cold War, we don't have an ideological enemy. Nor do we have any longer a geostrategic enemy that can be clearly identified as a permanent antagonist. We're living in a world now of 4, 5, 6 powers that, in terms of their capacity to influence events, are more or less equal. The United States, Japan, China, whatever emerges in Europe, whatever emerges on the territory of the former Soviet Union, Russia, the Commonwealth of Independent States, whatever it is, plus what else may develop in the next 10, 15 years in India and maybe even in South America. Those are the realities of our period. Certainly, in the nuclear field, we are uniquely powerful. But the issues to which nuclear weapons are relevant are diminishing, almost non-existent. Bosnia, Somalia, Central Asia, North Korea. In none of them is the use of nuclear weapons appropriate. And so our relations with other nations will be determined by capacities that are still superior to those of any other nations, but are no longer so dominant as they were in the Cold War period with respect to the non-communist part of the world. And, as I already have pointed out, new power centers are emerging. Now, in such a world, there are only two ways to have stability. One is by hegemony, and the other is by equilibrium. Now, whenever I say equilibrium and balance of power, they say, here he goes again, went to a German school, learned it in Germany, burns candles on Metternich's and Bismarck's birthday. And it's a great predilection of his. Now, I have to tell you, in Germany, I was obliged to go to a segregated school where Bismarck was not the favorite subject, and the glories of German history were not self-evident to us. So whatever I learned about equilibrium, I learned from my study of history. If my former Harvard colleagues can stand it, most of it at Harvard University, where they don't really believe in it, but I came to heretical conclusions. America grew up with the luxury of choosing its involvement. Most other nations grew up in the school of hard knocks, where they had to look after their security with narrow margins of survival. And what the balance of power says is we have to try to arrange an international order in which the disagreements and conflicts will still exist, but they are kept to levels which do not threaten the overall system, in which nations may compete, but within certain limits. And you achieve this by making it very difficult for any nation or a group of nations to achieve preponderant power. You don't rely on the goodwill, but on the self-restraint imposed by necessity. Now, I also believe that this works best not only when there is a balance of power, but when there is a certain community of values. And so the attempt to place equilibrium entirely on power can also have catastrophic consequences, as it did before World War I. But my basic point is that in the world into which we are moving, with these various power centers, some idea of the American national interest is absolutely imperative. And if we do not have this, we will find ourselves trapped time and again in situations in which it seems worthwhile to enter, but in which we either do not know how to extricate ourselves, or where extricating ourselves is very costly. Take Somalia. We became involved in Somalia because some television networks decided that they would take one case, very similar to 10 or 15 other cases around the world, of genuine starvation, and feature it. The American people, to their enormous credit, decided that this was an unbearable situation and insisted that something be done. And so long as what we were doing was humanitarian and financial, it was to the great credit of America, which took on the rehabilitation of the world at the end of World War II, which also no other nation has ever done before. But when we started sending troops into Somalia, is when we got into difficulties, because that left us with three choices. Either to stay there indefinitely and ignore the political conditions, for which there would be no public support, or to try to fix the political conditions which had produced this starvation in the first place, which, however, meant that in a country that for centuries had been torn by tribal war, we would end the clan warfare, and that guaranteed American involvement in a civil war. And third, that we would leave and permit the conditions that had brought us there in the first place to reestablish themselves. We tried the second course, as made sense. But after we had suffered 18 casualties, it was clear that we were not prepared to pay 18 casualties, much less any more. And so we were driven into the third option, which was to get out and leave the situation back to where it was. Now, I'm not blaming the people who got us involved. All I will say is I opposed it from the beginning. Nor do I blame the people who wanted to create a political solution there. I'm trying to draw the lesson from this, that if we do not know what our fundamental interests are, we will have more and more crises like this. Bosnia involves us in the same sort of considerations. And China does, at the other end of the world. I would say, first of all, that people conducting classical foreign policy would be very careful about taking on a confrontation with Japan and China simultaneously. I would think it would be better to have one of them on your side. If you challenge them both, you're surely doing it the hard way. But it is true that the Chinese record on human rights is inadequate by American standards. And it is appropriate for the United States to advocate its fundamental values. The question is not whether we advocate them, any more than it was whether we should give food in Somalia. The question is at what cost and to what length. And one has to remember that we have strategic interests in Asia, we have commercial interests in Asia, and we do not have the capacity to solve every problem that exists in the world simultaneously. How to strike that balance and in what manner to do it does not have a cookbook recipe. But that is the challenge of our period, especially when we face entirely new problems for which there's no precedent: population, environment, nuclear proliferation. And yet saying that these are general problems, which they are, doesn't mean that they will necessarily be solved in a global way, because many nations are not prepared to deal with them, even though they recognize them as a problem. So this is the situation which we face. And in order to get at it, I try to analyze a number of international systems that have existed at various stages in history, why they prospered and how they collapsed, what the various elements were, spending a lot of time on the Cold War period and on the American experience with international politics, and winding up with the contemporary world. Now, much of it then in the debate that any book generates gets absorbed again in the recent political debates. My interest is not to sit in judgment about this or that decision. I'm trying to say we are moving into a new world. What we need above all are concepts to deal with that new world. That you cannot give a good answer unless you ask the right question. And we face in particular not just a change of generations from the Cold War to the post-Cold War period, but also a change in perception which makes it particularly difficult. A change in perception from the generation that grew up from reading to a generation that grows up learning from viewing. When you form your ideas on the basis of words, you build on concepts, which to be meaningful depend on the relationship to other concepts. When you form your ideas on the basis of pictures, you form your views on the basis of impressions and of moods that can't even be recreated very easily. So you can look back and check what it was that impressed you so much. If you take the situation in Bosnia, for 18 months we have known from the newspapers what was going on. Then one mortar shell hits a marketplace on a Saturday morning, and suddenly public opinion gets mobilized, and the government goes into action. I don't say this as a criticism. I say that this is a new style of politics that is emerging, a new style of approaching problems, and it is a particular issue at a time when the future is so different from the past, so that we need some ideas, concepts of how to get from where we are to where we've never been. It's to this debate that I try to make a contribution, because I think in the end we can only learn from history. It's the only laboratory we have. Unfortunately, history only tells you the results of analogous situations. But each generation has to figure out for itself what is analogous. That is not automatically clear. So, at any rate, this is the problem that I try to address. And now you will ask me, you can ask me questions on any concrete topic or any other topic that interests you. And I would only like to warn you that I'm a believer in the de Gaulle style of press conferences. De Gaulle was of the view that he would not let journalists tell him what he should talk about. And so he came with 5 prepared answers. And no matter what the question was, he worked his way through one of the answers. If you're willing to ask questions, I see microphones. Are they supposed to line up at the microphone?
Yeah, I think the microphones so everybody can hear the questions, if you don't mind.
Come on.
Yeah.
They should line up at the microphone. Oh, my God. I thought I had escaped you.
Please review for us and tell us exactly what happened about the prisoners of war in the Vietnam War and your part in it.
The question is, would I tell exactly what happened to the prisoners of war? That, of course, is a very sore subject with me, because all the people who said, just get out of there and the prisoners will get back and don't worry about the prisoners, are now yelling that we didn't do enough to get the prisoners back. The problem was this. We did not knowingly leave any prisoners behind. And no American president or Secretary of State should ever be accused of such a decision. And it stands to reason that President Nixon, who for 4 years was accused of being a warmonger, that he did not have to fight for 4 years to leave prisoners behind. So that is simply an absurdity. The problem was that after the prisoners came back, and you must remember, we had no authentic information of who was a prisoner, except occasional lists which the North Vietnamese released to opponents of the war, never to the government. So we could never check it. That when the prisoners came back, there were a number of anomalies. That is to say, we knew immediately about 60 cases where there had been some information that they had been captured, either through voice contact on the ground or through other indications which led us to believe that there was a possibility that they had been captured. Those cases were raised within 2 weeks of our receipt of the list. Then there was another set of problems that concerned prisoners in Laos, in which it was even more difficult to find out what the reality had been. We in the Nixon administration, and I'm sure all our successor administrations, went through enormous effort to try to find out what the facts were in the first year or two after the war. When we could have engaged in military retaliation, we were prohibited by the Congress from engaging in any further military action. And we were deprived of the carrot of economic aid. So all we could do is talk about it. We lost both the carrot and the stick. Now, I personally do not believe that in Vietnam substantial numbers of prisoners were kept behind, because I don't see what motive they would have had to keep prisoners behind that they never used. If a year later they had said to us, we found a batch of prisoners and you have to pay us $1 billion to get them, that would have been something that I would have deeply resented. But that I could have believed quite consistent with what they were. So this is what I know about the prisoners. I testified at enormous length before a Senate committee, and the Bush administration made available to them the verbatim record of all the negotiations. And I believe that the committee was convinced that if prisoners were left behind, they were left behind in total gross violation of the agreement and by the Vietnamese and without knowledge of the United States.
In your book, you quote Bismarck as saying that the Balkans are not
be worth.
Bismarck also said once, woe to the statesman whose arguments at the end of a war are not as convincing as they were when he ended the war. And that, too, is something that we should keep very much in mind. Now, in Bosnia, we have two kinds of interests. One is a general interest that disputes should not be settled, international disputes should not be settled by force. And we have a moral and humanitarian interest in preventing certain kinds of violence and genocide. Those are legitimate American interests. We do not have a national interest in where the exact dividing lines are in Bosnia, nor, frankly, did we have a national interest in contributing to the creation of the state of Bosnia, which I think is at the source of all of these problems. Because I don't believe Bosnia has ever in history been a nation. It has been a geographic entity between the various empires and an administrative subdivision of Yugoslavia, of Austria, of the Turkish Empire. And the strange aspect of Bosnia is that its component nationalities, Serbs, Muslims, and Croats, seem to be able to live together, provided not one of them governs. They cannot subordinate themselves to each other. So I believe it would have been much wiser from the beginning to make Bosnia a UN or NATO or European trusteeship and attempt to see what happened under those circumstances. Now, I am very leery about American military involvement in Bosnia. I recognize our interests. I recognize the pain. I think the administration was correct in what it did about Sarajevo, which was addressed to a specific circumstance and could be solved with a specific proposal. I'm very uneasy about putting 25,000 or any other number of American peacekeepers, or so-called peacekeepers in there, who in a measurable time will become hostages to the passions of the contending parties and face us on an even larger scale with the problem of Somalia, even though I have enormous respect for the concerns of people like Margaret Thatcher and others, and though I share their enormous disquiet with all of the methods that have been used to fight that war. Yes, sir.
I'd like to get your view on future Russian foreign policy if Zhirinovsky were to become president.
If who?
Zhirinovsky.
Well, you see, with all respect, this is one of those questions which again ties Russian foreign policy to a personality. I don't think that Zhirinovsky is the cause of Russian nationalism. He's the expression of Russian nationalism. And if a nation has conducted itself in a certain way for 400 years, I draw from it the perhaps unworthy conclusion that this indicates a certain proclivity in that direction. So therefore, I think that for a variety of reasons, some of them very understandable, Russian nationalism has been one of the few cohesive forces in the society. No nation, I know no other nation that has been exposed to so many bizarre and cruel rulers in succession as Russia has had over the centuries. And therefore I think Zhirinovsky's words and the nationalism he represents is not created by him. Secondly, I believe that the current Russian government is also pursuing a nationalist, maybe less nationalist policy, which I define as an attempt to have a military presence in all the neighboring states of the former Soviet Union, and a gradual elaboration of a veto over all the countries of the former Warsaw Pact. And I would argue that American foreign policy should concentrate on Russian foreign policy and leave social engineering to the people in Moscow. And that therefore, while I have absolutely no use for Zhirinovsky, the message we should have for all Russian leaders is, if you stay within your borders, which have 11 time zones, so you shouldn't suffer claustrophobia, we can have a very good and creative relationship. If you engage in expansion, we will have to oppose you. Not necessarily by force, certainly not by force everywhere, but you will pay a price in American relations. I think this should be the basis of our foreign policy, and not these endless discussions of, do we back Gaidar, do we back some other person, what is our approach to particular acts of the Bank of Russia. It is not a question of personalities, it's a question of structure.
Secretary Kissinger, you have a very generous statement to the Foreign Service at the beginning of your book, which I read with a great deal of interest. And I recalled, after reading a section of the book that is dedicated to the so-called Cambodian incursion, when the president felt obliged to move troops into Cambodia during the Vietnamese War. This is about the time you had already become Secretary of State, and a member of this club, Clark Mullinoff, a Pulitzer Prize winner, was the ombudsman, focused on a group of several hundred Foreign Service officers who signed a petition opposing the president's incursion into Cambodia. They sent it to the New York Times. They gave it to you. They wanted it published. They wanted it made public. But I was told myself by Clark Mullinoff that you refused to give him a copy of this petition when he asked for it to investigate in the matter for the president. Did you withhold that document because you approved of the behavior of these Foreign Service officers? And did their behavior comport with your dedication to the Foreign Service, dedicated...
Just a minute. First of all, I wasn't Secretary of State.
Well, head of the NSC, then.
Well, the idea that if there was a document signed by 700 Foreign Service officers that Clark Mullinoff couldn't get a hold of is absurd. And the idea that Clark Mullinoff would come to me and ask me for the document as if I were the only keeper of that document, I actually don't remember that incident, and I don't remember this document, but surely the Washington Press Corps can get a document that 700 dissident Foreign Service officers have signed, and I would not spend sleepless. Now I'll give you my answer what I think about the Foreign Service officers.
The question is,
I will now answer your question.
Did you
I will answer the second part of your question.
Yes,
the first part of your question, the factual premise happened to be wrong, but I will nevertheless answer the conclusions you draw from your wrong premise, which is this. I admire the Foreign Service as a disciplined instrument of American foreign policy. They are the ablest people that I have been associated with, and if they disagree with the policy of the Secretary of State and the President, they should say so to the Secretary of State and the President. If they want to agitate outside, they should leave the Foreign Service. It is not the function of the Foreign Service to conduct opposition to the administration. Anybody who resigns from the Foreign Service under those conditions will have my respect. But I dedicated this book to the Foreign Service because it is an able group, it is a dedicated group, and if properly led, it will enable the Secretary and the President to achieve any rational objective. I did not dedicate it to to them if they think that all of them are Secretaries of State, and if they disagree with the Secretary of State, they then can go to the press. Then they should leave the Foreign Service.
May I ask one short follow-up question?
No, we've got a lot of people here.
I
I'm
think
sorry.
I've answered that question. Well, go ahead.
As an aside, I apologize for missing the date on your becoming Secretary of State. But it seems to me when you were sworn in, you were asked the question, when did you first feel like the Secretary of State? And the press reported, about 4 years ago. This was when you were NSC head.
You know, I've been accused of many things, but not of being totally stupid. And I don't think that I cannot preclude that I'm capable of unworthy thoughts, but I hope I'm not so idiotic as to make such a statement. And I don't think you will find such a statement in the record. After all, what I said, my press conferences were readily available, and you can research them.
Dr. Kissinger, you said during your talk, and you reiterated in your answer to the second question, that Americans tend to exaggerate the importance of leaders' personalities, national leaders' personalities. However, you also pointed out that America is unique in a number of ways. Right. And today, particularly with the importance of television in our electoral system, there are some who might say that we're approaching a charismocracy. You have to appeal. With all these things in mind, could you imagine yourself as the advisor to another nation's government? Would you say the same thing to them, or do you think that leadership personality in this country, in the person of the president, is perhaps more important in determining what America's foreign policy actions will be regardless of national interest?
No, I would make, you have to distinguish two things. One is, does a great leader make a difference? Of course. You can't imagine American history without Lincoln. It would certainly have been different without Wilson, without Franklin Roosevelt. I don't believe anyone else could have led America into war in 1941 the way Franklin Roosevelt did in the period between 1937 and 41. Nor can I imagine France without de Gaulle or Britain without Churchill. So certainly, leaders make a big difference. What I'm arguing against is to say we have a problem with this country. And if we either support the leader or remove the leader, it will solve the fundamental problem with that country. That I do not believe. And this is what I am reacting to identify foreign policy with getting ourselves involved in the domestic policies of other societies to an extraordinary degree. Yes, sir.
Dr. Kissinger, in your comments, you spoke very little about the role of U.S. foreign policy in respect to the United Nations.
Right.
I wondered if you might comment in two respects, whether it would be possible or appropriate for the United States, as part of its foreign policy, to make greater use of offices of the United Nations, either in the settlement of political affairs or in the economic development in other countries.
See, I have a terrific alibi because Sandy only gave me 20 minutes, so I couldn't cover every subject. So you'll never know whether I could have if I had. But dealing with the United Nations, there is a school of thought in the United States that believes one should strengthen the United Nations, and that in time the United Nations could become something like a world government, and that you could have an international police force that substitutes for national forces. This I do not believe is possible in the present circumstances, though maybe in 50 to 100 years it could become more possible. On the other hand, I believe that the United Nations can be very useful on a whole host of social, technical, economic, global problems, environment, population, a whole communications. In addition, the United Nations can provide a forum for the exchange of ideas that would be very difficult to construct under normal circumstances. And it can also provide for an international consensus when one exists, such as in the Gulf War, and hopefully on nuclear proliferation to Korea. The only thing that I believe is not possible at this time, is to multilateralize decisions of war and peace. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you very much for coming to Washington this evening. I think we all would be better off if we came to Washington more often. On that note,
you're trying to break up my marriage. Thank you.
What is any parallel you see between the Clinton administration's so-called partnership for peace and the abandonments of Eastern Europe in the 1930s, part of World War II? And on that, sort of related to that, do you think we are entering a neo-isolationist?
Well, I know you all read every article I write, so you will know that I have been strongly opposed to the Partnership for Peace because it creates infinitely more problems than it solves. The problem that one attempted to deal with is that the countries like Poland, especially Poland, but also the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Hungary, countries that either have borders with the former Soviet Union or would have borders with Russia if it regained control over its near abroad territories, which is what it wants. And the administration held the view that we must not create a new dividing line in Europe, and therefore grouped the countries of Eastern Europe, terrified of Russia, together with Russia, Uzbekistan, and all other former republics of the former Soviet Union into one great structure called a Partnership of Peace. It meant that the lamb was grouped together with the wolf in a peace partnership. And secondly, it was impossible to describe what these countries were going to do together. At a meeting, at a press conference with President Nazarbayev from Kazakhstan, President Clinton was asked what Kazakhstan was going to do in the Partnership for Peace. And he said, we're going to group together NATO, Warsaw Pact, former Soviet republics, and the neutrals into one big enterprise that can engage in joint military planning. For what? What are they going to plan for? Against what enemy? And if one implies that at some point Russia can join NATO, it means that all the existing protections of NATO disappear, because NATO is designed against aggression from outside of NATO. So if it means anything, it would be against China and Japan. It would remove the protection Germany feels it has against dangers from Eastern Europe, and this is why the Germans are so eager to get Poland into NATO, and have even offered to pay half the cost of its membership. And they're afraid of it also, because if you create a vacuum in Eastern Europe, you do recreate the situation of the 30s, and you do tempt Russia and Germany to fill that vacuum, and this is exactly what for 200 years has produced tensions in Eastern Europe. I think it is an ill-considered idea that we should abandon as quickly as possible. You tell me when.
Yeah, I think we have time for one last question.
Well, I'll run through each of the lines
all right.
quickly.
Oh, don't miss me, Dr. Kissinger. I've been waiting for you.
You've been waiting for me? That doesn't sound friendly, though.
lady, no woman has asked the question. I think we should have some woman.
What do you call Sarah here?
Sorry about that.
Sarah, my apologies.
Go ahead.
I believe I heard you say a little while ago that we no longer have ideological enemies. Two parts. How would you characterize the attitude of the Islamic Republic of Iran toward us?
Yeah.
And secondly, given that China may have been an ideological enemy before and isn't now, could they become one again?
I think that Iran is clearly an ideological enemy. It is not yet in a position to be a global ideological enemy, so it is not in the same category as the former Soviet Union, and therefore it doesn't preoccupy us as much. But I could imagine a situation developing, and that we must prevent of Islamic fundamentalism turning itself into an ideological challenge to the Western world and to us. So that is quite correct. I do not visualize China turning itself into an ideological enemy. I could imagine that if the relationship is badly handled on all sides, that it could become a geopolitical adversary, and that we would have to deal with it in very many difficult contexts. So this I can imagine, especially as it becomes stronger. Should we give this gray-haired gentleman a chance to whack me? Go ahead. No, you first, and I'll give you the last question. Then him and then you.
Dr. Kissinger, in light of the American Commission's role in Europe as a leader, how do you foresee Europe shaping up come the 21st century? What leading power do you feel will be taking America's role per se, or do you see it more as a, say, the 1815 Congress of Vienna made it as a balance of power?
No, I think that, first of all, the balance of power within Europe is ended. I cannot conceive that any West European country or any major East Central European country is going to go to war in the traditional sense. I can imagine ethnic conflicts, particularly in the Balkans, but that's about the only area where I can visualize a conflict in Europe. I believe that Europe remains a natural ally for the United States in the sense that in almost all the difficulties that I can foresee, we are better off, both of us, cooperating with each other, or at least be benevolently neutral to each other. We will not be able to continue the leadership role of the immediate post-war period, and we should not want to. It cannot be in our interest to plead for the responsibility for every area of the world when an area like Europe has regained enough economic and even military vitality to look after itself. But on the big issues that may arise, I think we and Europe should cooperate, but more on a basis of equality. And we are needed, and I think the Europeans recognize that increasingly, in a certain sense, for the internal balance of Europe, because without us, there is no way that Germany can keep itself, even if it wanted to, from becoming the dominant nation in Europe, which no other nation wants and which the present German leadership also doesn't want. Yes, sir.
Regarding crises such as the market attack as well as the Somalian deaths, people come together as a community and many barriers break down, whether political, religious, or ethnic. And in order to get to the new world order, perhaps there should be breakdown and giving up of some of the old orders. And do you agree with this? You mentioned, for example, that internal domestic interests should be given up by us, and also
I believe
personalities should be
I believe that.
What else should be given up?
First of all, I would like to make one thing clear. I do not argue that the New World Order is an American invention and that we have a great choice about this. I think a New World Order comes into being when either domestic structures change, population the relative populations change, technology changes, a whole series of events. And if you look at when various international orders have emerged, there were always some causes like this. In the 18th century, the states were run as feudal states, and a man was not considered a foreigner just because he spoke a different language. In the 19th century, national identity developed. So certainly, in the period ahead of us, some of the loyalties, some that were created, and some of the structures that were created in the previous period will change. We've already seen it in the Soviet Union. It's not, however, something you decide by saying, let's do away with some of these loyalties. It will happen out of technology, out of economics, and out of the change in the relative significance of states. And the real challenge is this. The German philosopher Kant once wrote that peace will come either as a result of insight or as a result of experience, either because of wisdom or as a result of catastrophe. So what I'm describing, there is going to be a new world. New nations are coming into the center of events. What it will be depends in part on the creativity of the statesmen that have to lead it. Now, you have the last question, and be kind to me.
I'll be very kind to you. I just want to remind you that I was at the State Department as a reporter when the reporters in the press room. I was at the time when you were Secretary of State, before and after, and still am, that the reporters at the press room liked you so much they named the racehorse Henry the K. But my question is more serious. The situation in the Middle East.
That. It's true.
It's true. It
didn't win many races, unfortunately.
It didn't run very often. The question.
I'll repeat the question.
The question. Which mic? There are two mics here. No. The question is about the Middle East and the problems associated with it. And if you were Secretary of State again, how would you handle the circumstances? Would you have had a Madrid conference? Would you have had an endorsement or support for the Declaration of Principles, which are now failing apparently, may succeed with bloodshed? Would you trust Arafat? You spoke about great leaders making a difference in diplomacy, and the circumstances of the time call for great leadership. How would you assess the circumstances, and what would you have done, if anything?
The first part of the question was, questioner reminded me that the State Department press corps, I don't know whether they bought the horse or how they got into possession of the horse or whether they stole it. At any rate, they came into possession of a horse by methods I do not wish to describe. And they named it Henry the K. And I was very flattered. By this. Now the question is, how would I perceive Middle East policy today? Well, the first thing one has to remember is, when you are on the outside, it is very difficult, and one really shouldn't say, what would you do in a set of circumstances you had no hand in shaping. And I confess, I never believed that an agreement between the PLO and Israel of the scope that was negotiated could happen, and I might have believed that it would be better to be approached in smaller steps so that one could check whether it was in fact workable rather than in one big leap. And therefore, I probably would have tried a more limited approach, but we didn't control it. The United States did not control this. It was done between Israel and the PLO. Saying this, I have, however, supported the agreement because the alternative of a continued stalemate, I think, would have had even more serious consequences. Now, do I trust Arafat? No, I don't trust Arafat, but I don't think an agreement should be made on the basis of whether you trust an individual. The question is, can one make an agreement in which the self-interest of both sides is such that it leads to a pattern of coexistence? I do not believe that the end, and I've always said this, of the Arab-Israeli conflict will be a document embossed in which the word peace is embossed in gold on top of it, and after that they live in perfect harmony, because I've never seen a conflict between Arabs settled that way, or in most other parts of the world settled that way. I do hope, however, that it may be possible, through the necessity of living together, to develop a pattern of coexistence that will improve the security of the Israelis and the dignity of the Arabs. But it is going to be a close-run thing, a very painful exercise with enormous difficulties. So this has been my general attitude. And now, just so that we can end with the lady, having started with the lady, this is the absolutely last question.
With the sanctions in Haiti not working, more boat people expected, how far should we go in trying to restore Mr. Aristide to power? Would you advocate use of a multinational force?
Well, I should have quit one question before this. But it makes it possible for me to say something that that not many people have heard me say. There are some problems in the world about which I do not have any particular knowledge. And I must tell you, it's maybe a reflection on me, I do not spend sleepless nights on that problem. My difficulty is that I have never met anyone who knows Aristide who does not think he is, to put it kindly, odd. And I've heard stronger words. On the other hand, there's absolutely no question that the present government in Haiti is appalling. So the real issue is, to what extent should we involve ourselves in trying to bring about a more humane government in Haiti, which probably will require some degree of military intervention. And I'd be reluctant to do it, but if I did do it, I'd probably do it without either Aristide or the present leadership and start from scratch. But I'd know that it is a process of many, many years and probably decades.
But he was duly elected.
Well, he was duly elected, but I don't know what a due election really means in Haiti. But certainly his conduct since the election, I'm not saying we should remove him. The question is, how much of a price are we going to pay to restore him? But I have told you right now, I hope Secretary Christopher never calls me up and asks my opinion on Haiti, because I'd probably be too proud to admit that I don't have a clear opinion. So I might tell him something that's wrong. Thank you very much.
Dr. Kissinger's going to stay and he's going to stay and sign some books for a little while, but we're going to make a line. The line starts right here. Please line up.
For the book signing, please form a line to the right. Please form a line over to the right,
Will the Washington Journalism Conference students please come to the front to see Mrs. Paris?
line up to the right, because otherwise nobody's going to get a book signed. Yeah, my right, my right, my right. You're just going to slow down the work and nobody will get anything signed. So let's have an orderly rise, please.
I want you to see the come back to our front.
Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger spoke at what's known as an author's rap session this evening at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., about his new book, Diplomacy. Dr. Kissinger is a graduate of Harvard University and served as Secretary of State in the Nixon and Ford administrations. He also was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973. You can again see this program later tonight around 10:40 Eastern Time here on C-SPAN 2. Later tonight, here